Hello, everyone. I hope you're coping okay during this difficult time. It's Jennifer Rousel here, and I'm from University of Bristol. And I'm going to talk about the notion of affective apertures, exploring the role of photography in literacy, research, and teaching. And I want to make this applicable for teachers as much as researchers. So I'm trying to kind of cross both. So I will have a little bit of theory, but then I'm going to have a practical element as well. And if you can hold off with questions, I'm only going to talk for about half an hour, and then add your questions to the chat room, and I can respond. So thank you for coming. So affective apertures, exploring the role of photography in literacy, research, and teaching. I'm going to start off with a quote by Susan Sontag, as I always draw in quotes for inspirations. And she said in her seminal book, this very insatiability of the photographing eye changes the terms of confinement in the cave, our world. In teaching us a new visual code, photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have a right to observe. And the reason I like that is particularly now with COVID-19, it's feeling literally like we're in a bit of a cave right now, we're in our caves, and that the visual has been a way for us to live in a perceived way. And I'm going to talk about literacy as a perceived practice in this presentation. So what do I mean exactly? So in order to explain what I mean, I want to do a little bit of a look back in time. I mean, I'm thinking way back to the 1980s with social semiotics, Kress coming out of the Hallidayan tradition, working with Hodge and others, thinking about semiotics and the ways in which semiotics is very interpersonal. So there was an emphasis on how it's trying to speak to certain kinds of viewers, onlookers. And then obviously what came out of that is multiliteracies in 1996 with the convening of a large group of people in the US, including Günter Kress, but also there were others who worked more in critical literacy like Alan Luke and Joe Lobienko. And they devised the multiliteracies framework. And then from that, digital literacies came along. With digital literacies, you had a whole bunch of different studies that came forward from people like Conal Lancashire and Michelle Noble and Guy Merchant and Kathy Burnett and Karen Woolwin. And so it was a very productive, generative time, as it is now, but we sort of moved into a different phase, and that's where this talk is coming from, which is a turn to affect and posthumanism. And affect is really trying to, in a nutshell, and I'm rendering it in kind of crude terms, but it's a way of looking at the non-representational and not focusing on what you can see with the naked eye, but actually what lies behind it. I'm not going to talk about posthumanism, but obviously that is in there as well, which is the growing presence and agency of material worlds. So with the turn to affect, there are quite a few traditions in terms of affect. And the one I'm going to draw on for this talk is Sarah Ahmed's more collective notion that has to do with the doing of emotions is bound up with a sticky relation between signs and bodies. Emotions work by working through signs on bodies. And so my concern is to think about it. She talks about it as kind of a sticky relation. So you sort of know it when you're in the thick of it. And it could be something like galvanizing a group who's maybe angry about something, like Black Lives Matter, or feeling a sense of just joy in a moment. And so these collective moments are captured to me through what I'm going to look at. It comes out of work by Aaron and Leander in their book in 2019 about the turn to affect and feeling the world in these affective intensities. So I want to talk a little bit about literacy as a perceived practice. So Kate, Paul, and I have worked on a book called Living Literacies. And in Living Literacies, we frame literacy around really senses and emotions, seeing, hoping, disrupting, making. And within this talk, it's obviously a focus on seeing and what's going on in the world in terms of literally how people are experiencing lockdown, and thinking about what people know and believe affects the way they see things. And it's the lens that we look through, it's the apertures that we look through. And designing and taking photos or visualizing in general are ways of can be ways of taking a metaphorical stance. You could just take photos to take photos as well. So that's there too. And taking photos can be a way of figuring things out. And with teachers who are listening to this, you can work with students doing really close-up shots or even microscopic shots. So I've done a research study with people with mental health and addiction issues where we just looked at objects in a really close way. And then you can also have landscape shots where you step back and you want to look at something in broader terms, or a bird's eye view where you want to look at a particular element or something, or an aerial view. So there are different ways you can play with perspective and thinking about what perspective does, either on a metaphoric level or also on a sensory level, how you experience it. And so obviously the post-human piece here is how it blurs the boundaries between humans and how we are and the material world, nature, technologies, and matter more generally. So I want to look a little bit at lockdown for a few minutes and how people are experiencing lockdown, mostly visualizing. But one of the interesting things I've found, and I'm sure everybody who's in the room right now have experienced this to varying extents, is watching in your community reactions. So here are some in my community. So around the corner, down the road, people have started leaving poems. So over 40 days of lockdown, every day there's a new poem that people put up and they share. And then slowly, you can't see this, but as the time has gone on, some people have just put an image. Like I think the last time I looked, there was a Heinz beans canned beans. But then you also have collective initiatives. So you have people putting rainbows in their windows for NHS, or you have artists creating pictures, paintings of frontline workers, NHS workers. Or you have old signs that take on new meanings. So in Bristol, this is a mural on a wall, Uncertain World. And obviously it takes on a different meaning than it did back in the fall, let's say in the autumn. This is an artist who decided to take a series of pictures for every day of lockdown in order to have different messages. So you see Vermeer here, an ode to Vermeer, and then you have paintings of the Queen wearing a mask, contemporizing things. I think one of the things that's fascinated me most is on Instagram, this particular feed, which has been Girls in Isolation. And one of my hopes as a study is to talk to some of these girls about what they're doing and thinking and being as they create these pictures. Now, these pictures are also culled and combined in very interesting and compelling ways, to me at least. So why and how do they bring all of these different photos together? What's the reasoning behind that? And then TikTok videos. So there are many of them. I know our daughter has made TikTok videos. I've been in some of them. And it's a way of passing time, and it's a way of sharing facts, and also other forms of YouTube videos and things. So this kind of way of turning to the world right now has been ways of predominantly visualizing. And so it goes back to something that I thought about before lockdown. And I suppose one of the things I would like to talk about as a group is how other people are feeling about the stance taken when you go out into the world. So we have our own ways of experiencing it, but how are we experiencing it when we go out into the community for a daily walk? And so in the work that I've done with photography, with teenagers and with adults and with children, I've looked at the notion of stance as a way of turning to the world. So we turn to the world in a certain way, and photographs can often say that, tell that. Stance can also be the ways, the claims that we make and the stories that we tell and how we tell them. And stance is also how things come to matter because of how we bring them into the world. So I think about Julianne Rose's visual framework, and how you not only look at interpreting the visual, but you also look at the site of production. You look at the before, during, and after with the photo. And I think that that's a really important dimension of working with youth, to think about how we visualize images as a modality, but also all the bimodal work, also the combining of words and moving images that go alongside all of this. I think the other key dimension in all of this too is in terms of affect. So Hannah Arendt is not an affect theorist, although I found her very helpful in talking about self-display and humans' urges to want to display in some way. So whether it's through words or whether it's through photographs or whether it's creating videos. I know my nephew is composing music and putting it on Instagram over the course of lockdown. And why we do this in order to create a certain standpoint and perspective for spectators. So what are we trying to tell them? And I suppose the newer idea I have is draws a bit on Spinoza, and that is the notion of substance. So in the world there are these core essential aspects of substance, and those substances are often told through the attributes that we use to bring it in. Now that's very kind of out there and abstract, and it's just germinating. And I might have a Spinoza expert out there who can correct me, but I'm feeling that might be a way into it. So I'm going to look a little bit at some research data, and then I really want to have a good half hour for people to talk or to ask questions or to maybe push against what I'm saying. So the research study is Maker Literacies. It's funded by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, that was set to end next year. And obviously I moved here, so the funding ended, but we collected all the data, and the postdoctoral fellow is Dr. Amélie Lemieux, who's at Mount St. Vincent, and a team of others. And the team of others really relied heavily on professionals. So a lot of my work is mostly centered on bringing professionals into classrooms and having them teach about modes. So we had 5 projects. We had one on film with a documentary filmmaker who worked with teenagers about a story based off of a story about homelessness and PTSD. There was another project on coding with professional coders who came in. We had a study on media text and the creation of short animated texts. And we had Jennifer Burkett come in, who works for a media production company, Larry Swartz, who's a graphic story writer, and together they worked with young children about how to create media stories. And we had another gaming project, which was fascinating. And I talked about that 2 weeks ago to a group in Norway about how they describe games as you make games, you design games for how they make you feel. And that was the phrase I loved. But I'm not going to talk about those projects. Instead, I'm going to talk about a selfie project called Face Value. And Face Value looked at the art of the selfie, but it also looked at building off selfies into self-portraits. And it happened over 6 weeks in a high school in the Niagara area with Dr. Peter Viken, and he led it. And Dr. Peter Viken is both a visual arts scholar as well as a professional photographer. And we worked with a visual arts teacher and 21 high school students who produced selfies, and from the selfies, they created a self-portrait with an artist statement. So for teachers who are in the room, it's a very nice way of working across modalities and having students create some sort of you can stop at the selfie and write an artist statement about the selfie, or you can move on to, if you're more adventuresome, actually making a self-portrait. And the self-portraits are wide-ranging. So you see one here that's made with yarn and glue. You see another one here on the screen that's made of a painting with shattered glass on top. So it went over 6 weeks. We started off with looking at Andy Warhol, Chuck Close, and sort of classic selfies, the history, the lineage of selfies. Then they each created their own selfie, and they coupled that when we did a final art exhibit with their self-portraits. So over 6 weeks, they developed them. And there was an art exhibit at Rodman Hall in St. Catharines, and 4 students curated the space. So it was this beautiful project that had all of the dimensions that I really like in doing multimodal work with teenagers or with children, and that it was active work with a professional. We were able to move in school and outside of school, and they were just very engrossed in it. So I want to look a little bit at some of the stances so that you get a sense of what I mean by stance and by substance. And I'm using that interchangeably, which is probably not a reasonable thing to do, but I'm going to try it out. And this is a stance by Jasmine, and I use pseudonyms for everyone in any photos they've given me permission to use for this presentation. So that's an ethical piece of the study. And she talks about the inspiration for the idea, which comes out of makeup. And makeup is often, well, it has in the past been denigrated as something that's hiding insecurities, but actually she celebrates it. And she is an artist, and she has been exhibited before this study. And she talks about how it's about self-worth, and it's about self-love, and it's about being able to celebrate that. And that comes out quite strongly in her self-portrait. It's not a great photograph of it, but it was like a diorama with a mannequin head with makeup on it. And in the background, it's supposed to sort of give the sense of a window and looking into a window with a spider's web. And there are two sides of the face as well. And that was a lot of teenagers I've noticed have done that two-sided face. I think that there were about 3 in this study, and in previous Cindy Sherman research studies, there was this sense of having that Janus-faced side of identities, which I found very interesting. But I wanted to juxtapose it with a really interesting way of planning it out and brainstorming it. The next stance comes from James, and James was a fascinating young man. And then I did a second study with James, a makerspace study on Saturdays, because he is a maker in the makerspace tradition. He's been making and involved with makerspace pedagogy since he was 13. And so he said in his stance, a mind is as unique to each person and is in essence who we are. And this will make sense when you see what he made. Which I'll show you now. And that's his selfie. And then what he did was create like an MRI machine, which had light strobes, colorful strobes of light flashed onto a clay casing of his face. And I was amazed, and it looked beautiful in the museum space that he could do this. But he said for him, it's the kind of thing he always is doing. He's always got a project going. And this was something he sort of cobbled together out of a large wooden box and a series of cables, and you see LED lights, and you see a variety of things that are affixed to the wooden box. So James was more into the design than he was in crafting an artist statement and really thinking about affect. But there were some very strong women, and this is one of the young women in the studies who wanted to really look at feminism and speaking out about how she turns to the world, as I said. So her pseudonym is Zelda. And so she talks about how she embedded a stance in the kind of visuals that she developed. And she talked about in the interview. So this is not from her artist statement, it's from her interview with her. And she talked about speaking her mom's reaction to it, which is how she found it quite a political piece. And she just responded saying, you know, she really wants to get across the sense, which again, you'll see in her visual. There's the brainstorming, which I love. I thought that was a beautiful, just very quick drawing that she made, and juxtaposed with the actual painting. And in the painting, you see a whole bunch of little green hands around. And then insults she's heard over the years. So you prude, stop acting so sad, you wear too much makeup. And these are insults she's had over the years, and that's what she wanted to really represent and visualize. Stance number 4 is about materials. So this is a delightful young woman, Lila. And she said to me early on, she brought in her best friend's front fender, and it was huge. And she brought it in the first day and slammed it on her desk. And she said, I'm going to incorporate this into my self-portrait. And indeed, she did at the end. In the end, she broke it up into pieces. I don't know how she did it. And then she affixed it to what you see here, which is her, which was in the entrance as you come into the art gallery. And it's Lila's head with a series of bits and bobs, as she calls them. So she says in her artist statement, I've always collected beach glass and bottle caps and useless bits and bobs that float around my room and make a mess. And this artwork is a futile attempt to apply meaning to a habit formed early in my life, to connect it to myself in a way that validates my need to accumulate garbage. 98% of this portrait is assembled from trash found on the street, the beach, my room, or in the no-frills parking lot, and the rest is paint and hot glue. And this piece is representative of me in all its messiness, dimension, and lack of adherence to what is expected. And what I thought was very impressive with Lila, and with all of them really, is how clear she was about A, what she wanted to do, and B, how she was going to visualize that and materialize that. So this has sort of been a whole bunch of hitting you with a whole bunch of things at once. And what I wanted to cohere here is how these young people, in a real Masumi sense, in that kind of Manning Masumi sense, were able to feel the world, feel intensities, and be able to materialize those in these texts. And I suppose a lot of those community visuals that I showed at the beginning, to me, strongly illustrate what Ahmed was saying about a social glue. And I know I look at those things every day when I go by as a habit, and I either read the poem or I go by a mural nearby that says, through art we rise. And those kinds of visuals are anchors for us, aren't they? They're artifacts for us that steady us. My friend Claire talks about that, how literacies can steady us during times of uncertainty. And so I want to know from all of you about whether this resonates with you, whether you're finding these sorts of concepts interesting or compelling. And so I'm done because I really want to allow time for people to ask questions. So I see a couple already. So Helen Jones, thank you. Do you think social media limits the stance we see? For example, does it only reflect the stances of those we like and follow? Okay, well, let me have a think about that. I do to a certain extent, although we often, what I find very interesting about Instagram is that we're able to select topics that get filtered in and blended in with the people we know well and the things that might interest us. So what's an example? I might get things from my nephew or from friends in Canada, and be able to see their lives through Instagram, just the way I'm not on Facebook, but just the way you can through Facebook. But at the same time, it's blended in with something like a New Yorker cartoon that I send. So every day I've been sending my friend Kate New Yorker cartoons, and it's been a way for us to just say, hi, are you okay? And we don't actually use words. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, but to me, it's ways of just sending something very quick as a check-in. And I just am curious if other people have done that. Julianne Burgess, hi Julianne. Are you attuned to what is not in the photograph and what is left out and why? I'll turn on my camera now. Yes, I am, although I always struggle with this, and I know Amy Storniolu asked me the same question at LRA, and my response wasn't great, which is that what you can do is you can talk to youth, you can get to know them, you can co-produce with them, but you can never be in their head as they're doing it, right? So, so what is not in the photo is something that you can either sense as an absence, you can actually address it and talk about it, you can maybe juxtapose it with other visuals, but I suppose I don't have a great response to that. I'm curious what other people are thinking. Kathy Burnett. Hi, Kathy. I'm interested in the idea that literacies steady us. Could they also expose and destabilize us? Yeah, in fact, I was very I had one of those bad weeks last week because I was trying to propose a bid that was saying they steady us, and two arts reviewers said, rightly so, well, yeah, they don't always steady you, and I think that's utopian and naive to believe that, and they can be really upsetting. So I love that question. They do destabilize. I think for me they steadied me because I've been able to kind of go from having all of these Zoom meetings to be able to focus on one thing. So that's a very subjective kind of a stance, I think, or belief or contention. Um, what are some examples, Kathy, of things that images that maybe destabilize you or others? Okay, so Nina, I have a question, Dr. Russell. I love the work that has emerged from this Selfie project, and I'm wondering how or if this work is transferring into an English classroom. So that's one of the struggles I have, and there's so many amazing English teachers that I've seen over the years who do far more creative things than this project, for example, and they have used them. So about a decade ago, I worked with someone in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, and she did really interesting work with magazines and critical work with young people about race and about feminism and about disabilities, having to do with a series of images. And she did image work every single day. And the image work tended to be a segue into writing. So I have obviously a bias for cross-modal work. So I love work that goes from one modality, crosses into a next, and then you have transmodals going on. And having young people think about what's more important here. Is the image saying more than the words, and how do they function together? Are they working in a harmonious way? Are they working against each other? So I know it is happening. I think what I can say is I don't think it's happening enough within policy. So I don't think nowadays policy has met that challenge, unless someone in this whole chat room can give me examples of policy that actually does that. I think, and it's a very tricky thing to do, I know, but I do think that more curricula has to have that and have students engage with it because they're just so attuned to it. At the same time, they don't necessarily know some technical visual rules, for example, that I think professionals have. So I think I saw Becky Perry asking something, but I have to kind of figure out how to scroll up. Here we go. Okay, Becky, I'm interested in the pedagogic methodological approaches which enable young people to undertake this sort of work and encounter and create these sorts of disruptions. Thank you, Becky. That's a really nice question. I think that what is key to the setup is you have to spend some time in that, let's say in a classroom or informal setting, right? So you have to get to know youth. You have to be able to bring in my view, professionals, which I know on a practical level is very difficult for or can be difficult for educators, but it is possible. And the other thing that I've always done with these projects is have time designated whole retreats where professionals work with teachers. So if they can't actually go in the classroom, they co-plan. And that's a very nice setup for students because it gives them that sort of insider view and educational view, and then loads of studio time. And the other thing is money to buy materials. So one of the things I found with the face value project, and Peter did all the legwork on this, is getting art supplies. So Shirk provided those kinds of funds so that we could buy really interesting things that they could do. And we said, listen, anything you want to do, we'll make it happen for you. So I think that those ingredients are really important. So co-planning, professional teachers, conversations with youth, scaffolding the particular modality as well. So what was also really important that I didn't realize at the time was the selfie lead up. So teaching about what Chuck Close did and Andy Warhol and the thinking that went into creating selfies, I wouldn't have been able to do. So that was really helpful. And it used to happen more in media studies. Yeah, you're right, Becky. I remember way back when in 2000 when I did my PhD with Brian Street and I would go to classes by Gunter Kress, there were people at the BFI doing this kind of work. And I know there are people who at the Institute of Education who still do film work and other people, but it's for some reason, it seems to be something that doesn't inform literacy as much as it used to, unless somebody in the chat room can correct me. Hello, Sue. It's lovely to meet you. I love what you shared today. I'm keen to look at in terms of process versus product. So I too am interested in your theoretical analytical pedagogical frameworks. I'm also interested in your perspective on the ethics of the selfie. So there are huge ethical issues about whether you include a selfie or not. I only include selfies, obviously, for people, young people who said, yes, you can use it in presentations, you can use it in your publications, but a lot of them don't want to share that, and I respect that, and I don't think I'd want to share a selfie. So it is something that ethically you have to have those conversations about, and youth set the terms for that. And I suppose the other aspect of it is that sometimes there are things that come up that are just deeply private, and you know they are, even if a youth doesn't say that. And I know Diane Collier and I had this when we did a similar study with family photos with young people, that there were certain things that were shown that you just knew couldn't be a part of it. And I don't know if that's quite what you're getting at, but photographs can be, I suppose, like writing, but even more so, I think, with photographs, can reveal sides that are deeply personal, and that you just have to use that instinct as a researcher and talk about it. Hi, Chris. Let's see what you say. This is fun. Currently, I'm obsessed with film photography, and it really helps me to see how the process of photography is important, as well as the final product. So any insights about the process involved in digital taking of photographs from any of your projects? Yes. So I didn't really attend to the process versus the product, and I'm kind of greedy in my research. I want to look at both. I'm very interested in the thinking, in the feelings, in the making, and probably more these days in the making, because I think that there's something we're missing that's really important that I don't have my mind around, that goes from a bunch of matter into a thing that's made. And I've talked a lot about that with Kate, and Kate and I have looked at it in terms of artifactual literacy. Kate Paul, artifactual literacy. She's done beautiful work in Africa looking at this sort of thing. But in terms of specifically looking at the medium or the means by which people visualize, film photography is film work, stills, if that's what you're talking about, Chris, are helpful. It's tricky with dealing with moving image versus stills. I suppose people would argue that you can't really take the still out of a moving image, if you know what I mean. And it's because it's about the kineconic movement of that. It's about the kineconic sense of when you're watching a visual that is actually kind of almost vibrating in that sense. So that's really not a great answer to what you're asking about. But one of the things that I'm thinking about when you ask me this is, in most of the work with Peter I've done over the past decade, we've used disposable cameras. And one of the reasons, and you can't really find them anymore, so we stopped that with face value, but one of the things I loved about the disposable cameras is it really forced young people, teenagers, to think about materialities in shots. So with all the Cindy Sherman, I think we did 3 different Cindy Sherman projects, and Cindy Sherman is a photographer who creates conceptual photographs of ideas like the 50s housewife or the 70s feminist. And so the disposable camera let them get one shot and not keep editing and taking a series of digital shots. So to me, digital can take away from that because of the capacity to edit and the capacity to filter. And I know I chatted with my daughter about how there's a sense, she says that it was a really interesting comment. She said she goes to school here in the UK, but when she's back in Canada, she has a different filter she has. And I found it really interesting the way young people can kind of think in terms of filters that they show the world, that resonates. So that's okay. So Meg Wellington, hi. Just to comment on Melanie's question, I'm a photography teacher. Oh, I love that. And we conduct a full project about selfless selfie. So I'd love you to email me, Meg, about that. And I wish you could talk during this webinar. It's just me talking out to you. And I'd love to hear about that. Let me see if I can go a little bit. I'm terrible with trying to get into your chat and actually move it down to find out what you're saying. Students find it a bit more tricky. Let me just see if I can. No, I can't. Okay, well, Meg, please email me. Claire Dowdle. Hello, Claire. Do you see the collaborative TikTok video as an evolution from a selfie? to something that represents us in our social world as in a different way? I'm sure it is. It's a really good question. I don't know how others feel. I don't, in that I think of it as a 20th century, it's not a metaphor. It's some sort of, it's a figurative way of expressing something. And I say that because TikTok videos aren't often literal, are they? They often play on the symbols that are embedded in them, and it's up to the viewer to interpret them. So I suppose a selfie does that, but I think that it's more, I know, it's more of a post-human way of doing it, I would say. I would say, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe, I mean, it's more about interactions between humans and the objects and what they tell you, I think. Now, that's not fully evolved, so anyone can correct me, but I somehow think that TikTok videos have this playfulness and trickery to them that a selfie may not have as much in terms of what a selfie does. Cassie Brownell, I'm on an iPad, can't seem to access chat to ask, but I'm curious how work like this, especially with the need for materials and relationships, can reimagine the moment of COVID. It's a great question, Cassie. Okay, especially with the need for materials and relationships. I think the thing is, it's a lonely time for everybody. So I know people who are home with small children. I know people who are older at home. I know people who live alone. I know couples who are away from their children. You can get all different combinations, but the truth is that there is a solitude here that's both. This period in history to me is so paradoxical because sometimes it's calming and sometimes it's upsetting. Sometimes it's uncertain and sometimes it's almost definitive in terms of the world changing. So the reason I keep going back to Girls in Isolation every day, for example, is that it is a way for women to be able to visualize their relationship with others and the world and their stuff that they're around all the time and renegotiate it, recast it, maybe think about what their stance is again, and maybe it affirms a stance, or maybe it doesn't. Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit of a slow reader. Melanie Quince, that sounds wonderful. I'm interested to explore this in the English classroom. English teachers, I do feel that my presentation does not do justice to more pragmatic, practical, pedagogical lesson ideas. So I do hope from this that you can really share that. It's a very much sort of a slight conceptual mess, but it's something that I think is timely in that it's happening now in real time, and I know it's important. Cornelia Owens, working in this way is very close to how good teaching happens in primary schools. Very good, absolutely. As we become more data driven, this holistic approach has sadly disintegrated and is now preserved as a luxury. And I think that's true. And I think it's a really tough time for teachers on many levels. And I think if we can work together, researchers with teachers, with policymakers, we can start to make a real difference in terms of how the visual can be leveraged, how we can almost create safe spaces, maybe in our homes, helping through online teaching. That's a very vague answer, but I think that's certainly true. Mary Rose, it's a lovely name. We're about to launch a whole school writing project to create a history book of this time of school closure. We have asked children to submit photos of their home classrooms. I love that. I love that. One of my colleagues, Dr. Lucy Kelly, is doing a similar study with Claire Lee, and they're looking at a diary toolkit like this. Children just visually documenting what's happening. And no, I'm sure you are focusing. You're saying, having listened to you, I realize that we are focusing on the wrong things and we're in the midst of a lot of sorts of pedagogical. I just believe powerfully in the visual that I think the visual can serve as a talking point. The visual can you can be in the midst of it, in the middle of it. It can serve as an end result that you look at and you just appreciate on an aesthetic level. Hi, Emily. Salut. You're always so nice to me. Do you think there's a silver lining in the anonymity of these public? I do, actually. We had a discussion yesterday because Harriet Hand and Mark Shillito are doing a session on mapping, and we created these maps, and I was really embarrassed about my map, and I remember thinking there's no way I can upload it to Padlet because it was really badly done, or it was also just a bit too revealing, and I liked the idea that we could just upload it and we didn't have to acknowledge that we did it. Or I think anonymity is incredibly important, and that's why the Rolling in the Deep study I referenced, which was with mental health, people with mental health and alcohol and drug abuse issues, and were open about it, did not want, obviously, things like selfies or anything. They wanted to focus on objects, and they wanted to do microscopic shots of objects and look at fractals in objects. And the beauty of that is that we could just look at material worlds, and we didn't have to, and through the material worlds and the agency of material worlds, we were able to talk about our own feelings and where we sit. Hi, Meg. Totally doable. Teresa Lovett. Hello, Therese Lovett, maybe. Thank you for sharing. Would you mind elaborating on your idea of literacy as a perceived practice? Absolutely. And that's really Kate Paul's notion. Kate and I in our discussion came up with that. And there's a chapter on it in Living Literacies, which is a bit of a shameless plug for our book. But in Living Literacies, we talk about in our research how we have looked, we've leveraged the visual in order to do work with children, with teenagers, and with adults. And what that, and how being able to see literacy is not just about literally with the naked eye seeing, but it's also the notions that Christian Ehret talks about, which is that we exist in these worlds and we feel these sorts of things. And you can write about it, or you can use different modalities. But I think that it's not always foregrounded the way it could be in literacy. There tends to be a focus on what is the performative nature of literacy. So what an essay that's written, and how does it sound, and how is it crafted? And we want youth to be able to acquire an understanding of the aesthetic response that went way back to Rosenblatt. I mean, Rosenblatt talked about looking at efferent and aesthetic, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that. Oh, hi, Teresa Kremen, guru in literacy. I'm interested in the notion of perceived literacy too. Can you elaborate? So perceived literacy, I'm thinking about ways of, Kate's done in a lot of her work, the ways in which she's done, had youth go through communities in different cities and take photos of their communities. I've done it over the years in the US and Canada, and I hope to here. And that's having young people use the visual either as a bridge into doing cross-modal work, let's say in classrooms, but also as a way of thinking about visual beyond words as I don't know, a way of explaining it, a way of saying, this is an effective visual for these reasons because I'm trying to say something in a certain way. And you know it when you see it. So the queen wearing a mask in that painting to me is so powerful. And when you see it on a wall, or in Bristol, when you see a Banksy, you know from seeing it that you can describe it in a certain way, you can write it about in a certain way, you can feel a certain way as you're with it. Do you think that photography simultaneously sharpens students' observational skills whilst also reading the world, which may provide them with the raw material for then writing about the world from their standpoint? Well, absolutely. So this is brilliant, and this is exactly relates back to what we talk about in the seeing chapter, which is, I'm neglecting to say that part of it is about this sense of why posthumanism is even kind of important. This feels like an abstract notion to a lot of people, but I think one of the reasons why posthumanism, particularly now, is rising in STEM and in math education and in literacy education is that we're starting to realize how key matter is in terms of how we understand the world. So observational skills allow you to do that. In that with posthumanism, you can look at the climate crisis in a very kind of dramatic way when you either look at visuals or you look at what's happening in the world. You can also see it in terms of the ways technologies function as a part of us. Right now, I'm talking to all of you and I can't see any of your faces. So it's different from giving a talk. I can't look Sonia in the eye and explain what I'm doing. And so one of the things that visualizing can hopefully do is being able to attune you to those moments when you can see, and then those moments when you can't see. And how observation gets undermined as a sense in some ways by other things like spoken or listening. But I could be wrong about that. That's why it's hard just me talking out to all of you, because that isn't a fully evolved thought. But I do think that a big piece, especially this is something Kate emphasized, is that literacy needs to be an observational, a pondering of the world. I suppose for me, it is a relational thing. What the photographs have been such a gift over the years in getting to know a child or getting to know a young person without asking them confronting questions. So in that way, it is observational, but I don't see it as a way of that sensing when you look at a mural or when you watch a movie. I think of it more as a way of connecting with someone in a gentle way, maybe, but maybe I'm imagining that. So I'm thinking back to the reviewers I had, especially a relatively harsh review that sort of said, that's not what arts, you're assuming that about arts. But for me, arts can connect you to other people in really powerful ways. Becky Perry, I think both selfies and TikTok videos are inherently pedagogic with inbuilt creative constraints that we need some more unpacking. Yeah, we do definitely, because I think Claire's right about Claire Dowdall about what's the relationship between a selfie and a TikTok video. And those are the discussions in terms of English teaching that we need to have. So we need to have that in the same ways that we look at multi-genre texts, in the days when I would teach teaching methods, right? In talking about teaching poetry versus informational text, etc. Nowadays in the classroom, there's a place for saying, what's the difference between a TikTok video and a YouTube video and a selfie, right? And those layers of juxtapositions can be so generative with young people because they sort of live it, but at the same time, they're not an authority on it. They don't necessarily know about the rhetorical framing that happens. Okay. I'm sorry if I'm missing anybody. Oh, here we are. Okay, so Becky's responding to Rosie May. I just wanted to agree with it, with an idea, and to say, for me, choice is important. As I said, I'm a slow reader here. I'm going back. I've sort of lost the track here. I saw genealogically. Sorry, Becky. I've lost the plot. You'll forgive me. I wanted to say for me, it's important to pedagogically, both in terms of mode, print, image, audio, music, and focus. I love video teachers, the videos teachers are making for their classes. I love them too. So one of the interesting things that's happened is that I've been able to see teachers I know adapt, and they've been very openly Luddite, almost antagonistic about screens, and how they've taken it up in a very quirky, idiosyncratic way. So, for example, I think about my brother, who's an English teacher, who now has his own little YouTube channel. And he just interviewed Hamlet the other day. And I watch it every day, and I see him in a different light. And I know that there are many teachers out there who are trying out these things. And at first, and I know I'm working on online courses now, like probably many people out there, and really worrying about it. And I think just just getting in and rolling your sleeves up and mucking about with different kinds of platforms has been very, very helpful for me to think about this and to think about how our relationship with the visual and how teachers are taking it up, I think is really fascinating. Now I know my time is fading. Sue Wilson, I agree about the gentle side of the arts and photography. Sometimes the most private person can share more about themselves. Thank you. Yeah, that's lovely, Sue. I personally, I agree. I've been very moved by these photos, girls in isolation, and also by their willingness, because I'm in the process of putting in ethics, but you know, in chatting online with them, which is something obviously I can't share, they're very open about what they're doing and grateful that people are even sort of looking at them and seeing them and thinking about them. Penny Roach, do you think that this is a good way of exploring connotations? And absolutely, and their meanings in the classroom, definitely. And Penny, one way of doing that is to juxtapose maybe an image with a sort of a line from a canonical text. So I really like that. I'm thinking of that students sometimes find it hard to write or talk about connotations, but visually, instinctively have an understanding of the importance of multi-level meanings. I totally agree. And the thing is, I should be very clear that I love writing, and I'm a big believer in using multimodality as a bridge into writing, which some would be an anathema to certain multimodal thinkers, but I think that it is a very nice way of scaffolding and bringing in an understanding of layers and how photographs do that. And I think that there are visual grammars for that. I think there's Gunter Kress and Theo van Leuven. There's Machen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. There's O'Halloran. There's Carrie Jewett has some, and obviously Halliday. I'm careful with those. I adapt them, but I also think that visuals, trained professionals have a tacit understanding of them and the way that the modes function. Michelle Cannon, I went to school in Girona, Spain, several years ago. I went to a school who taught much of their curriculum through film and media. Wow, I love that. They made cameras with juice cartons and took them out into the countryside to frame the world. I absolutely love that. That is brilliant, Michelle. Thank you very much. This is a way into literacy. Yeah, and this is why I love makerspace, because makerspacing and making is a way of starting to inhabit that mindset. Hello, Yingji. Compared with written work, will the visual method limit the expression more? For example, young people tend to use similar filters offered by Instagram. Yeah, I think that this happens, but what I find fascinating are the workarounds. So what I find fascinating, the ways they get around that to create their own more subversive and push against filters. So I do think that they're constraining, but I also think what's interesting is the way an old-fashioned kind of the way people would subvert written text, that like banned books, the way people work around these sorts of constraints. Okay. Cornelia Owens, for primary pupils, the whole concept of narrative and image is so easily explored when we work in a multimodal way. Mental health simultaneously is stressed in a very safe and natural way. Yeah, it is. I think one thing I'm really struggling with at this moment, though, is because I feel after COVID, it's very important to do arts-based making work with youth to work through what's happened during this period of time, which hasn't been all bad, but it has been very uncertain, and it has increased anxiety for everybody. And I'm not sure, again, arts professionals would necessarily say that it's ethical or fair to do that. And I'm only saying that, again, based on having this review from arts people saying that you can't really do that. You have to be very careful about how you frame care. So care to me might not be care for someone else. And so the subjectivity in there is very important. My time. Okay, I only have a few more minutes. This has been really fun. I hope I haven't, I'm sure I've missed people in the chat room. Please email me after if things kind of resonate with you. I deliberately had a short presentation, but I'm also happy to talk through other things and do a little plug for UKLA. it's an organization run by Trish, and I think I'm done now. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a great rest of the day and take care. Bye.